Well, welcome everyone to this session on decarbonising the supply chain. I'm Charlie Henderson. I'm the facilitator for the session, which is going to be for an hour. I work for a company called Southpole, and we are a consultancy company, and we develop carbon projects. Now, supply chain emissions they're becoming one of the most kind of critical arenas in corporate effort to tackle climate change. So this session is relevant to anyone who is really serious about tackling emissions, carbon footprints in the round, and it's increasingly rising up the agenda really fast for a number of reasons. First of all, Scope 3 emissions, as they're called in the trade, which includes the supply chain, they typically account for something between 60 to 80% of the average footprint of a manufacturing company, for example, and also they make up a large proportion of service sector emissions through flights, etc. Attention is increasingly turning to these sort of harder to reach carbon emissions because efforts to tackle on-site emissions and electricity, for example, through renewables and energy efficiency, have been going on in many cases for decades. So this is like the new frontier. And many of the quick wins from energy efficiency and renewables have already been taken. To get carbon targets approved by the Science Based Targets Initiative, SBTI, Scope 3 emissions, supply chain emissions have to be included and tackled if they account for more than 40%, which, as we've already heard, they do in most cases. And added to which, with the announcement today and the increasing focus on 1.5 degree trajectories and pathways, these Scope 3 emissions become more and more important because they are the biggest proportion of emissions. So, it's really welcome, and it's not before time that supply chain emissions are becoming, more and more important. So the big question then is, how are businesses tackling this big problem? And I'm delighted to say that we've got two very distinguished panelists with us today who can give their perspectives on what they're doing, what their businesses are doing. And also, we'd love to throw this out to the floor and to hear your questions and your perspectives too, and your comments. So, on my left, I have Alexandra Brand. She's the Chief Sustainability Officer at Syngenta, which is a provider of products to the agricultural sector, where she's been for 4 years. And on my right, I have Kim Hellstrom, who is a CSR strategy lead at H&M, which is a high street apparel retailer, and he's been there for 11 years. So first of all, I invite them to introduce themselves and just give a quick overview of what they're doing at their businesses and how important this agenda is to them. So, Alexandra.
Yeah, thank you very much, Charles, and thank you very much for all to join this session this afternoon. We hope after the lunch session we can really have an intensive dialogue with each other, that you kind of get fresh energy after your stomach is working. Also thanks to the Ethical Corporation, actually very personally, that just for this conference they've put together actually this book about soil health, because when we talk about decarbonizing agricultural supply chain, we will talk a lot about soil health. And I thought, for all the lonely people who last night were reading this thing in their hotel rooms, this will be actually a pretty boring panel when I speak up, so I maybe can be a little lazy. So you already said my company is an agricultural supplier company, and we are every day out with thousands of farmers. And these are our customers, and they witness every day what climate change means to them. They witness every day what biodiversity changes and losses means to them. Many of our employees have farmed themselves. So in that sense, we are in a good environment to have a right sense of urgency in the company. What does climate change really mean, and why looking at carbon in our supply chain really plays a huge role. Because of that, we have a very clear carbon strategy, and it comprises of 3 components. And I would think 2 of these components are rather unusual and not covered by any Scope 3 thinking. The first dimension for us is, how can we help farmers to adapt to climate change? when they witness more and more torrential rains, when they witness longer drought period, when they witness the invasive species coming into fields they had never had before, how can we help them to adapt? What is the role a company like ours has to play, and how we are adapting our research investments to these sort of changes. So we do have agricultural models, we have agroclimatic models, we have soil models, we have disease models in a very dynamic way where climate modeling is certainly influenced by the way we see really the on-field climate for growers going forward. The second part of our strategy is how can we help growers actually to mitigate climate change and use the mitigation potential they have. And this is all about what is in this book here about soil management. Soil is actually a carbon sink. And there's really good global modeling going out there which says that agriculture is about 10% of global carbon emission. It has the potential to mitigate 80 to 90% of its own emissions with the way it manages their soil. So that is a distinct part of our strategy. And we have set targets, and we can talk about that later on land productivity, carbon productivity, soil health management, and with that, again, lining up R&D investments behind. And the third part of our carbon strategy is the classical one, the own carbon footprint, reduce the carbon footprint. We have 7 million metric tons in our scope 3. That's not nothing. About 2/3 is coming from our operations and our supply chain on materials, and 1/3 is coming from our own agricultural supply chain. And we have a reduction target coming up, which will be science-based, and it will be around 50%. We're currently in the process of getting the science-based target set up and then later on also accredited and implemented. So that's about our carbon strategy, and I'm really looking forward to getting into a discussion and dialogue about that.
Great, thank you, Alexandra. Interesting that you see yourself as a sort of steward in the round around climate change, not just looking at the carbon effectively balance of the of the farm. So that's very encouraging. Over to you, Kim.
Thank you. So I work in the CSR department, and my role is to develop and integrate the strategy for climate and water within the group. We currently have 8 different brands. We are in 72 markets, and we are about 300 people working in full-time in CSR right now. And most of them are working out in the production markets. We have about 40 in the head office in Stockholm, but all the others are close by to the actual suppliers and their factories that we're buying from, that we're sourcing from. We set according to ourselves, very ambitious target to be climate positive no later than 2040, and that should be by reducing more greenhouse gas emissions than what our whole value chain emits. And we are also taking into account the customer phase, which is usage of washing machines, dryers, and also end of life. And that stands for about 20% of our scope 3 emissions right now. The strategy we're using, we're basing our strategy on 3 pillars. The first one is energy efficiency. There's a long way to go. There's a lot of low-hanging fruits within our supply chain. The suppliers need to be trained, and we need to raise the awareness of how to build efficient water treatment plants, how to efficiently take in natural lighting, upgrade the sewing machines and stuff like that. So it's a lot of basic stuff going on in the energy efficiency area. The second pillar is renewable energy. We are aiming for 100% renewable energy within our supply chain. And of course, own operations also, we are already at 96%. But to be true, our own operations is a fraction of our total emissions. The third one then is, the third pillar of our strategy is climate resilience or carbon sinks. And that can be everything from material, having material that actually sucks up more CO2 than what the process of creating them took. It can also be climate insetting, classic insetting like that. We're forcing our whole organization to do everything they can when it comes to energy efficiency and renewable energy, so that the later part of unavoidable emissions will be as low as possible. But we are aware of that we will probably not reach zero, and therefore we need to do some kind of compensation in the end. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So already this conversation has broadened from just looking at the supply chain all the way back to the farm on the one hand, and then use phase at the other. So it's quite an interesting way of, maybe we could tackle that step by step and start to dig into the detail a little bit of how, Alexandra, you go about engaging at that farm level, and how you can start to maybe even account for the carbon that's saved at the farm level.
Yeah, excellent. So I'll start maybe with our own agricultural supply chain. We don't have own farms as a company, but we do contract farmers to grow the seeds for us, which we then sell to other growers. We are interacting with about 40,000 farms, and we've started about a decade ago actually coming from child labor situations, an accreditation program on these farms. We've then seen that when we do that, we work on social standards on the farm, that we actually have a quality upgrade of the seeds we procure, and with that we have a cost saving. So it was really absolutely made business sense to do that. And then, we looked at how can we further improve that farm operation together with the growers. And then we found, practices like, low soil disturbance practices, which helps growers over longer drought periods, which creates more soil organic matter. And that's really, a practice which is more and more adopted. And then about 5 years ago, we made a commitment that we do really want to help growers on soil health, and with that, carbon productivity on their land. So these are targets that we set. We want to impact 10 million hectares of farmland and on good soil management practice, and we want to help land productivity to be up by 20%. And to have carbon productivity on farm up by 10%. Now, how is that actually working? I mean, these aren't just numbers, and you might not know really what you do. It's a big change program for a farmer to adapt from, the classical way of growing, wheat or corn or soybean into a much more complex rotation. Leave the land also bare for a year, grow maybe pasture, things to feed to animals, to the animal chain, and with that, gradually build up soil organic matter. Growers need financing for that because it's complex. Growers need market, which can offtake these different produce, and growers need actually different agricultural technology. It changes a lot which seed you plant into a low-till soil versus a seed you plant into a classical plowed soil, because the soil is just a very, very different quality. So it had an impact actually on us. What are we doing research for which agricultural markets and systems? So I think it's a pretty ambitious program what we are trying. Mechanisms we have used, how do you make that happen? Yes, we can control 40,000 farms in our supply chain today. No, we can't work with millions of individual growers when we want to achieve a 10 million hectare commitment. So we've been working actually with the food value chain, who is also kind of an aggregator of farm practices. We have been working with standard setting organizations who provide transparency to growers. We've been working with digital companies, with growers who invest into kind of their own mini SAP system on farm, so farm management system? How can you get metrics in a meaningful way? Growers don't know climate, science-based targets. Growers can't deal with carbon emission, but they know a lot about soil and soil health. So how you can translate really, values from the global commons into something which is meaningful for farms. So that's kind of the approach we've been trying to take.
Excellent. So moving up to the next stage in the value chain, if you like, you get to the manufacturers. So Kim, would you like to tell us a little bit about what you...
Sure. Again, we don't either own any own factories. We have about 2,300 factories that we source from. We are working on decreasing that number. It was 2,900 some years ago, and we're aiming on decreasing that even further also to get a little bit more impact on it, because the factories doesn't need to sell to us. From some factories we buy only 5 or 10% of their total production, making us a very small player for them. In other factories we are really big players, and we are also very keen on having the suppliers making sure that they have more customers so that they are not dependent on us. In total, in Scope 3, we have 18 million tons. These are estimates made by a third-party consultancy company. We are also aiming the coming 2 or 3 years to go over to more and more real data wherever we can. There are many technical challenges with that, and but it's still something that we're committed to do, so that we know exactly where the best efforts can be put in, where the investments or the actions are needed. As a whole, out of those 18 million, about 70% comes from the production. And then it's mainly electricity coming off bad grids, basically coal-based grids, China, Bangladesh, Cambodia, Indonesia. And the other part, if you look at tier 2 mainly, is the heat generation. So the boilers that are standing in the suppliers' factories, creating steam basically for the production. Those are by far the biggest emissions. And as I said, that's 70%, and then you have the customer 20%. So it's not so much left in the rest is not so much to work with. So our big battle the coming 5 or 10 years is getting the energy to become cleaner and making the heat generation either solar-based or at least decreased emissions from them.
That's quite a battle. And have you got some suppliers in particular who have already started on this journey, and can you take some learnings from that?
Yeah, the size of the suppliers are different, very different. Some of the suppliers have 15,000 employees. Some of them maybe have 500 if it's a dyeing plant, for example. So the size is very different. Some of them can by themselves go into SBT, which we are encouraging. We are approved in SBT. We have an absolute target for own operation, and we have a relative target for Scope 3. It's 40% decrease in own operations, and it is 59% per product in Scope 3. Yeah.
So what are the kind of levers you use to influence? I mean, it's bites into your buying power, I guess. That
sure.
Is one of the main ones. But
I mean, if you look at it from a long term, what we're trying to do is that we're trying to lift our suppliers to a level so that others will also be interested in them, to buy from them. We want the H&M Group brand. If you're a gold supplier to H&M Group, others do not need to do a due diligence. Smaller companies doesn't need to do what we're doing, because we are basically saying that this is, we're setting the standard. If you buy from this factory, you're fine. And that's also something that the suppliers would like to strive for. So that's one part of our approach.
Okay. And a question to both of you is what sort of sense of, what kind of scale of change might you be able to expect in the next, 5 to 10 years? Do you think it's realistic to hit, those targets you mentioned, for example?
I can start. I mean, when it comes to the targets that we set for science-based target, for example, we're quite certain that we will hit those. We haven't overreached there. It might be that we need to reconsider setting a more ambitious target within a couple of years, but as it looks now, we will reach it. Sorry.
No, that's...
Yeah. No, it's same for us. I mean, I said we are in the process of setting up the science-based targets. We have in the materials part of our supply chain, we have to deal with 200 key suppliers because we have 90% in scope 3, and these are 200 key suppliers. We're very confident that we can work with them because we also see a lot of municipalities. Really, this is just tailwind we are getting on changing the energy sources for some of these industrial zones where we are procuring from. On the agricultural part of our supply chain, I'm very confident actually because we already have full control over it with labor standards. We have 40% already under climate smart agriculture, how we call it, and transferring that to 100%. I think that will be really easy. You asked, can we kind of compensate our own footprint? And well, yes, of course. I mean, 7 million tons of carbon, that is equivalent to 4.5 million hectares of soil. We have already done 10.8 million hectares of soil, so I could easily say, we are even more than net zero. I mean, we're just great. But the question is more, should we? I mean, isn't that a carbon benefit which shouldn't go to growers? Why should that go to a company like ours? Same if we say we're impacting 10 million hectares of good soil management, means providing a carbon sink in the soil. Why should that come to a company's balance sheet? I mean, what we would get when growers change their practice, if we are doing it right, if we're doing the right R&D investments, we would get additional business from that because we're innovating for these agricultural systems, and I think that should be our reward. I do think the carbon credit should go to where they are really generated, which would mean a company like ours would never be net zero, but the overall planetary impact would be much larger. And we are dealing here with farmers, we're dealing here really with families, and we see a lot of governments actually discussing changing their subsidy schemes to include agriculture and carbon trading, and I don't think it should go to companies like ours. We should get the reward from the way we innovate.
Great. Thank you. So let's, first of all, let me encourage anyone who's got a question to stick their hand up. We don't have a Slido, I believe, but we can do the old-fashioned way. So if you want to stick your hand up.
We have a Slido.
Oh. We do? Oh, there we go. We do have Slido. Right. Right, so let's just interject with a couple of questions here from the floor. So one to you, Alexandra.
Yeah.
What role can tree planting play in the farming sector on climate change mitigation water?
Okay. It's a very, very large question. Let me try to illustrate that by some examples. When you look at the global carbon sink model for agriculture, if agriculture could come to mitigate 90% of its carbon emission, this is just done on managing the soil differently, getting the carbon back into the soil. When agriculture then would look for land productivity, we could actually look for a reforestation of the land which has been cleared, and with that, maximizing the carbon land. So on a global scale, agriculture absolutely must have these two parameters in its scale. Use the least land you can use to really allow nature and reforestation to happen. Now, this is something an individual farmer certainly can't influence, but they can look on his or her farming operations. And we've been trying to support farmers with very, very simple things. So do you really need to plow the field to the last meter? Or can you really kind of leave the last meter aside, create, if you wish, almost like a buffer? Can you plant this buffer with, maybe not with forests, but with grasses, which provide habitats for natural predators of the insects who want to eat your plant, who want to eat your cotton, for example? Could these buffer be kind of strengthening the soil to provide, to help soil erosion from happening? So these are all things we have been, it's a bit more than experimenting, it's a bit more than piloting, because doing these things really at scale and being able to measure the impacts is tremendously difficult. But these are all the kind of technologies and tools we are trying to promote, we are trying to develop. Sometimes we have government support. So, for example, in high erosion countries like Spain, especially southern Spain, you know, the local governments were very interested into mitigating soil erosion to keep agriculture productive, to keep the rural communities vibrant. So there we can help design these systems for growers, that growers don't need to trade off a good environmental management with actually the productivity and the family farm income. So yes, these things exist, and I do think they will be supported stronger in future by government and by subsidy schemes as much as private financing mechanism. I'm really convinced of that.
Thank you. Right, and there's a question here for you, Kim, which is around how do you actually, well, I'm guessing the sort of the practical process you go through to engage suppliers on carbon reduction?
Number 3.
Yes.
Yeah. So things we can do is, of course, we can give them bigger orders. That's basically what every supplier is asking for. Or actually, it's also consistency. Suppliers ask more for consistency than price. Price is actually number 2. They want to be able to have long planning so that they can plan their staff and so that they can do longer investments. That's one part where we can go. In parallel, we're also trying to impact through UN and through cooperation with other companies, cross industries, to impact governments, and then having our suppliers then being one step ahead of the regulations, because normally the regulations takes a lot of time and moves really slow. And then we try to have our suppliers already ready when the regulation comes. And again, as I mentioned before, if you're marked as a gold supplier with us, you should be, as a supplier at least, be proud of that and be visible. We should lift you. We're trying to lift those good examples.
I also believe a lot in these platforms you can form pre-competitively. We are part of an initiative called Together for Sustainability, where a lot of suppliers buying from the materials part of our supply chain are coming together. We are sharing audits, we are sharing best practice, we are training suppliers in what we would expect in sort of standards, environmental, but also safety and health standards for their employees to be set. And I think there is a lot of leverage in that. And this is also, you know, when you then have a supplier strategy, like what I heard from Kim, to really build up your supply chain with a really good key account management, I think you can achieve a lot, because these people really want to stick with supplying a company who has helped them. And what we very often see is when you help suppliers on environmental standards, on social standards, they have a cost advantage because they have less off-quality material, they have less incidents, they get either regulatory approval from local authorities. So you really, with that, almost catalyze a supplier company to be more successful. I think we're seeing the same dynamics what you see in the textile sector from our material supply chain. Definitely, these things work.
Excellent. Good to hear about the positives. So let's dig into the sort of the challenges now. Just in our little huddle earlier, we talked a bit about the complexity of the supply chain, and you may be working with some of your major suppliers, but there's lots of gaps in between. So how do we reach those really inaccessible parts of the supply chain?
Yeah, that's, I mean, I would love consumers to really buy ethically, to buy sustainably. I think that's what we all want. So how can we create consumer brands which transport that sort of messaging to consumers, and then, you know, close all the gaps from the consumers down really upstream? That's something I would dream of. The big job is then to do with whatever is coming from the field, whether it's food, whether it's fiber, whether it's fuel, whether it's feed. You know, how do you get into the granularity of about 800 million farmers on this planet, their practices, their footprint, and that being aggregated up into all our fully globalized supply chain. So I think that is something where there's a lot of gaps to close. We have been seeing one system at work in the United States. It's a consolidated market when it comes to food supply. It's a consolidated market when it comes to growers. It's a highly innovative market. It's a digitalized market. And there you can make these systems work productively. So concretely, Walmart has the gigaton target. We all know about that. Suppliers to Walmart are looking at the carbon footprint of the produce. For example, companies like Kellogg's. What is the carbon footprint of the breakfast cereals? They turn to the growers, the areas from which they purchase the wheat. They ask growers, what is your carbon footprint and what is your reduction strategies? And growers come to input suppliers like our company and say, how can you help? And then, you know, the food companies like ours, grower organizations, we set common standards, we do the science together, and all of that is based on a digital model that over time will really provide full traceability, trackability of the supply chain. At the moment, it's mass balance based still, but over time, the investments in the value chain, in the grain trade will come to really have a full segregation of, you know, different agricultural produce. So you can see that evolving. Getting that really done with 800 million growers, with the deconsolidated food and fiber sector, that's an uphill challenge, absolutely. It's a financing challenge, but, you know, technical-wise, you can see this vision one day coming through from our perspective. But for me, the biggest question is how do we get the consumers to, you know, taking different purchase decisions?
Yeah, would you like to elaborate a bit on that topic, Kim?
The challenges, yeah. I mean, for me, the biggest challenges by far is financing. We are talking about decarbonizing the electricity grid and the energy creation. And the technology is there. The technology is in many cases cheaper than fossil fuel, but the business case is not there, and the payback time is too long in combination with the business setup that we have in the textile industry. We want to be flexible. We want to have quite short contracts. Maybe we promise 1 year contracts for 1 year, maybe sometimes 2 years. Then we urge them to do investments in solar panels or solar heating that maybe has a return of investments in 7 years. And of course, that does not align. It's clear. That's also why we're looking at in decreasing the number of suppliers so that our impact can be higher on those, and that we can have more of a partnership instead of a customer-supplier relationship. That's one part. But financing, I can go back to that as many times. I'm looking into green bonds, for example. How can we finance? How can we help the suppliers to finance their business? It has to make sense for them to do the investments that is needed. But from an innovation point, I wouldn't say that there is, on the electricity side, on the energy side, there's no need for new innovation. There's need for, of course, cheaper products, and but the business cases needs to be created for the supplier, and that is by far the biggest challenge that we have.
And how about consumers? I mean,
consumers.
Yeah. Talk about your customers and, you know, whether they're making demands of you as a business.
as you said, I would like them to do bigger demands, actually.
It's up to all of us as customers.
I think I've heard it earlier today that customers usually talk a lot about it, but then when they come to the counter, the wallet speaks more than the maybe what they're willing to do to actually. The price is the most important in the end. I think that I would love to see a more stronger consumer push or movement, or call it whatever you want. The Greta movement, for example, that goes on in Sweden, that hopefully will grow. But as I see it now, it has to be. I don't trust consumers to do these choices fast enough. We as a company will listen to the consumers, that's for sure. That's what we always do. That's what all companies are doing. But if the consumers are not showing it by putting the money where their mouth is, basically, we will not change. Other companies will not change. So therefore, it needs to be driven from the corporate. It needs to be driven from governments. It needs to be high regulations. We are pro-regulations, but it has to be, of course, then neutral from a competition perspective.
Is there anything you'd like to add about the customers and them driving, for example, organic food or,
Yeah, we definitely see a segmentation of what consumers demand from their food. I think the most known segmentation of food is organic versus non-organic. I think what's also pretty known is locally procured food. It's actually funny, I have to say, I'm living in Switzerland. I recently was able to purchase Swiss-grown salmon, which, a supplier tries to cater to this purchase local trend, but I really don't know if in the Swiss Alps we should grow salmon. So maybe there is something right with what you say, don't trust the consumers. Not everything what they might want and aspire to really make sense. But this is a segment which is evolving. We know of a couple of food brands who are trying to create, the low carbon footprint food. And then certainly there are all the health brands, which are more or less regulated, so more or less, really science-based proven to be healthy or not, the food. So there's a lot of discussion around food. There's a lot of polarization about food. And what we see that this certainly is very difficult for governments to set regulations on that, because what is really what the voters want if you see such a segmentation, and what is really the metrics on which you optimize your entire food and agricultural supply chain. We've discussed today carbon. If we would just optimize it for carbon, the food and agricultural setup would look very different if you would optimize it for biodiversity management, if you would optimize it for land use, how much land is used, if you would optimize it for costs. And I think that's really tricky for any regulator in this global food agriculture supply chain to set matching regulation, to not do trade-offs which really harm the planet and the communities who live in the villages. And I think it's an ever ongoing dialogue, an ever evolvement of the regulatory systems, of the global trade systems, and with that of companies who play in these value chains, because you need to constantly update your business models and your portfolio in that. So being static in such a debate as a company is absolutely impossible. So I think there are really a lot of conflicts, a lot of gaps, a lot of things we just don't know how we can optimize the whole system.
Yeah, I could see that's a massive challenge, and gathering information at that kind of policy level, the macro level, and then feeding it down to the farmers is going to be difficult, and influencing them at that level. We've got a very popular question on that subject, which is there a specific technology, or imagine a technology that could really help you in this mission?
Yeah. A non-GMO technology for corn to get nitrogen out of the air into the soil, because that would really decrease the fertilizer footprint and have societal acceptance, because it would be non-GM. If that would be there, it would be gorgeous.
Okay, then I will take an existing technology.
Good.
It's a company called Absolicon, who is doing these solar heating collectors. solar collectors for heating water that can heat water to 170 degrees. No need for burning coal, no need for burning wood fire. So my dream scenario would be that someone felt that this is an awesome idea and build a factory in Asia so that we don't need to import, or that the suppliers don't need to import it there, builds this technology and puts it on close to the factories. It can take 3 kilometers away from the factory. Existing technology, no funding.
And that would be for steam generation?
For steam generation.
Steam and electricity.
Because the problem with solar panels is that it's so inefficient to heat water from first of all, solar panels have 20% maximum efficiency, and then you lose it by boiling the water. If you use it directly to heat the water, you have about 70% efficiency. And yeah, it's a completely revolutionizing technology. It exists, but nobody can pay for it.
It's the investment gap.
It's an investment,
the investment gap.
And that, I mean, our 18 million, if that, in my dream scenario, if that happened, I could probably take away 8 million of those 18 million.
Wow.
So that's a game changer for me, that technology. But how do I incentivize the factories? Because another challenge is, of course, that the heating generation as they have today, when they just buy uncertified wood or coal, cheap coal from China, is a very small part of their total cost, making it even more difficult for them to take the investment that is needed for this. So maybe if it could be like a rental setup or leasing setup or something like that.
Inspiring stuff. And are there other companies or examples of best practice that you've noticed that you think may be applicable to your businesses?
Well, we have in the food sector certainly a couple of leading companies who look for sustainable agriculture. Kellogg's is one of those companies. We had Mars earlier here on the panel. I do consider them not just in carbon, but also human rights aspects. It's really, really leading. Well, we all know Unilever, who moved into sustainability first as a large corporate. Their commitment to palm oil and deforestation. So I do think they're really leaders in the food sector from whom we could all learn to very holistically manage that situation. So I do admire them a lot.
And Kim, others, competitors.
IKEA is, of course, someone I always try to mention when it comes to their sustainability work and especially climate work. We have a lot of cooperation with them. We're from the same country. We have quite easy to cooperate with them. We have the same values within the company and similar culture, company culture. And why I look up to them is that they are completely relentless in their strategies. They take basically no excuses whatsoever. They are aiming for 0 emissions. They aim for the stars and hope to reach the clouds or however you say in English. But and that impresses me a lot. They are not afraid.
And are there specific to the supply chain, are there measures they're using that?
Very similar to us. We're actually cooperating with them closely in how we measure. We do almost. We have very different products, of course, but we have very similar ways of measuring.
And in, I mean, my limited experience of Sweden is you quite often have industry collaborations where there's a leading business that will create a partnership and, you'll all get around the table in a non-competitive kind of environment and learn from each other. Is that something that you...
Yeah, and again, we try to do that. We have, for example, we have a Swedish organization which we are founders of, which is called Stika, where we're trying to help all the other, I think it's 37 Swedish fashion brands to basically set up science-based targets without joining the Science-Based Targets Initiative, because it's a very expensive process. So we're basically helping and supporting them to do a similar thing with the same standards and procedures, but with no cost, basically. And then we're also, as I mentioned, we have several cooperations with IKEA in Indonesia, in India. We're working on them on a strategic level to set the same kind of wordings. We're in the UNFCCC together. So when it comes to climate or CSR, maybe climate, there is no competition. There is only cooperation. That's what it's all about, actually. Yeah. That's what makes it also interesting and enjoyable to work with, even though it can be tough. Yeah.
That's true. Corporations and partnerships, I mentioned this Together for Sustainability initiative, where materials procurement organization came together to share audits, to share, best practice around supplier management and decarbonizing suppliers, managing HS&E better. So that's a platform which really works. And the more people join, the more materials procurement organization join, the more powerful this will be, and the easier it will be for the suppliers to adhere to that. So that's a platform which is working, but I also want to make a pledge for collaborations across the value chain. I've been mentioning this example of Walmart, Kellogg's, the large wheat growers in the US and Syngenta. So these things along the value chain work. We are currently setting up a new initiative in Brazil to look at degraded lands. We want to bring these lands back into production, that agriculture can grow in Brazil without touching the critical habitats of the rainforests and the cerrados. This has never been tried before, and there are a lot of partners you need. You need science in that, of course. You need grower organizations in that. You need financing in that, definitely, absolutely needed. You need the traders in that, the grain traders who export these sort of crops or the meat produced on this land, and you need technology providers like our company. So these sort of platform, from my perspective, really, really helps it is worthwhile investing across the value chain.
So taking a couple more questions from the floor, I think I could combine a couple of these together, which is how far down would you go? How far down the supply chain would you go? And, what's the biggest difficulty? So maybe we could kind of combine that into one question, which would be, are there parts of your supply chain that are just kind of out of bounds? They're just not worth tackling currently because they're too difficult to reach?
Yeah. So when I would set up our ambitions freshly, I would have never touched 40,000 growers in the first instance. I would have looked as the key 200 suppliers, which is kind of 90% of our scope 3, and I would have started to work there. And it's historically grown that we were first starting to touch the difficult part of our supply chain. In the scope 3, I think it has to be manageable. It has to be material, and I think maybe it's a learning from the 40,000 growers. It wasn't coming from carbon. It was coming from another material issue, which was child labor. So when you think of carbon, what other material issues you have, which you can really combine to create a larger impact than just carbon. I think that's maybe a learning I would take, and with that defining the depths on where you go and setting your priorities and the investments around that. Yes, and we do have difficulties. I mean, how do you maintain these sort of standards, this sort of low-carbon agriculture, ethical agriculture for 40,000 farms? We change suppliers, of course, we do, over time. Some growers go out of business, the daughter or the son takes over the farm, a certain farm operation's just deteriorating over time. How do you continuously going and help and train? So you're never done with that sort of management. I think that's also something one must be very clear about when you go down that route, that it's not kind of, okay, a 3 years project and then I dismantle my team. It's a constant effort when you go down to such a granularity. And so it must survive a CEO change, these sort of programs.
Kim, which bits do you think you will tackle last?
Our scope is tier 1 and tier 2. And we're basically, because that's measurable, we're using this Higgs tool for measuring that. We also take into consideration the raw materials, but that's more of an estimate we're doing there. So tier 1 and tier 2 is the answer to the question.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe a question to Kim, because you were saying in the tier 3, you're trying to have less suppliers, better, higher quality suppliers. How do you see the synergies with quality management? And is that an angle to say, you know, the way you measure the quality of what you procure really goes hand in hand with the ethical standards, with the carbon standards? Have you seen that connection, like we did in our supply chain?
No, I don't know if I have. Maybe I just don't have the knowledge. But when it comes to what you're taking up here is the quality standard is also something that is difficult for us when it comes to longer contracts. Because what we've seen when we try to give longer contracts in some occasions, we have to be very careful because the quality tends to go down. That's,
oh, really?
Yeah. Not always, but it has been there. So therefore, it's also we're scared of for that reason.
Understand.
Yeah, or scared, but yeah, we try to avoid it.
Yeah. Understand that.
A bit of a technical one for you, which is around how carbon is actually put back into soil.
Okay.
And a related question around agroforestry.
Yeah.
Could that be a greater part of?
Yeah.
The farming
So.
system?
Carbon getting back into the soil. There are soil organisms which, well, it's basically photosynthesis, I think, is a known concept. So there are organisms in the plant and in the soil who can capture the carbon dioxide and convert that into organic matter, so into leaves, into roots, into nutrients. And when you harvest the crop and you leave the roots and the stubble, everything on the field, the organisms will then digest this sort of organic material and will kind of store that in the soil. So you really have, the carbon dioxide being chemically converted into organic matter, which then is left in the soil. And these are mechanisms you can measure over years. We have very degraded soils, which maybe have 1 or 2 or 3% carbon left in the soil, and we have very rich soils, which can go up to 12, 13, 15% of organic matter in the soils. And this can happen within 5 years from now with changing agricultural practice. And because that soil is not only rich of carbon, it's rich of nutrients, you can get down the fertilizer footprint on what it does. It's much richer in terms of the organism it contains, the earthworms really tilling and kind of loosening and airing the soil in the right way. So there's a lot of benefits when you allow these kind of mechanical, physical, chemical, biological processes to happen and not disturb that by your farming practice. So that's hopefully not a too technical answer. I'm a chemist by training, so I could go down really detailed. But soil science is something really fascinating for scientists. Sorry.
Well, one thing I experienced in a former life, I was working in Africa at smallholder level, and one of the challenges was people are so dependent on inorganic fertilizer. And to encourage them to a natural fertilizer system means a lot more work. It means more water, more organic matter to create that compost, etc.
Yeah.
So
I think you need to look at where do you get started, and every farm is different. We were talking about agroforestry. Some of these systems are naturally occurring when you think of the cocoa value chain from Western Africa. That's an agroforestry system, and we by no means should in any way change that system to an open land system which we have for some of the coffee supply from other countries. So these are systems which must be preserved. Is agroforestry a system which is working on low productive agricultural land? I think that's something we must absolutely try out. When we reforest land, when we have the space to reforest land, can we try to establish agroforestry? Absolutely. These are things we must try. Where I'm not so much in favor of is just promote one agricultural system. Agroforestry usually is less productive on the land, And we, by all means, want to have lands which are very, very high productive, that we can conserve the untouched nature. So it's not an answer for all agricultural systems, but where it's existing, preserve it. When you reforest, consider agroforestry, because that also provides really vital rural environments that people can earn, a living from. Just don't go into, stupid agricultural land expansion. But think of that more holistically.
Right. Well, let's have a think about the future. We're down to our last 5 minutes, and there's a couple of related questions for you, Kim, around conscious clothing ranges. We say that consumers aren't there yet, but can you, at what point in the future do you think that might be viable? And what about durability of products? Is that something you'd like to touch on as well?
Yeah, I can try. Well, durability is a difficult thing because sometimes the price gives the consumer an idea of that it's easier or less of a problem. If it's a low price, they assume that the product is also of lower quality and therefore treats it worse. Maybe washes it too often or just throws it away because there's no effort in throwing it away if it just costs £4 or something like that. So that's a challenge. Of course. What was the first question?
And ethical consumers, at what point might, in the future, could you imagine they might want to pay more for ethical, more,
that's
conscious lines?
Yeah.
$1 million question.
Yeah, that's $1 million question. But, I mean, we have also, we have material goals, circularity goals. We have a lot of different dates for different things that will happen. We're doing LCAs on all our materials. Depending on which brand it is, we're setting up different strategies. If there's a brand that uses a lot of cotton, that's where they need to focus on minimizing. Maybe another brand is using wool, and then we look at the LCA numbers and try to set individual goals for each of our brands. But I can't say a date. I mean, we have something called conscious collection, but it's more about we're trying the market to see if they are prepared to pay a little extra for a certain level of sustainability. But again, those are also, from a CO2 perspective, those are not, I would say, not more conscious. It's still produced in similar factories to the others. It's more focused from the society on the social aspects when it comes to conscious, not the CO2 question.
Yeah. Good point.
And the future of sustainable agriculture and your role within it and reducing emissions down the supply chain, Alexandra?
I mean, growers, farmers are seeing the effects of climate change every day. They're seeing the effects of biodiversity loss, and so it's in their very best interest to start getting prepared. It's in their very best interest to look at what they can really do, and how do they, get productivity and profitability on a new level. So that's why I do think growers and the agricultural sector will respond well to these sort of new technologies, to these changes. But it will take time. I mean, we are talking here to 80%, these are family-run businesses, these are not companies. They need to take decisions, in the developed markets, is the decision, do I buy a new tractor or do I buy a digital tool to footprint my farm and connect myself to the food value chain, or do I buy, higher quality seeds to get a higher yield? And in the very smallholder markets, I mean, we are down to decisions of, can my children go to school, and how does that relate to the way I manage my farm? So the least thing these smallholders certainly think is about carbon footprint. So the growers are exposed. There is a case for change. There are opportunities they have, but it will take time. It will take a lot of efforts of many players along the value chain, including, people like my company, the financing sector, but also governments to help growers to contribute in a positive way to climate change.
Excellent. Well, it's a positive note to end on. I've certainly learnt a huge amount, so thank you very much, Alexandra and Kim.
Likewise. Yeah.
And thank you to everyone in the audience for participating so well. And if you could just put your hands together and thank our panel very much. Thank you.